Let's turn to Genesis in chapter 22. Genesis 22. We were looking at verse 10, where we see that Abraham lifted up the knife to slay Isaac, and we saw that Isaac was a young, healthy, strong man who could have resisted his father and got out of that situation. But he didn't do it, which shows something of the way in which Abraham had brought up his son. It would be quite something if we could bring up a son in such a way that when he's 25 years old and we lay him on an altar saying, "I'm going to kill you because God's told me to do it," and he just lies down there and submits. We've really got to admire Abraham for the way in which he brought up his son in the fear of God, and more than that, in confidence in the fact that whatever my father Abraham says or does is the best for me. Even if it means he's going to kill me, I'll accept it. It's really something fantastic. We see further in verse 11 that as Abraham was about to do that, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." Now, there are only, as far as I can see, 7 places in Scripture where God calls a person with a double call, like here, Abraham, Abraham. It speaks of a time when God was so delighted with Abraham's obedience in this which was most costly for him. And just in passing, I'd like to mention where the other references are, where God calls a person by a double call. It's in Genesis 46 verse 2 is another reference, where God spoke to Jacob. The interesting thing is that all these double calls of God are very significant. Abraham, Abraham is the first one. In Genesis 46:2, we see God speaking to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." God said to him, "I'm God. Go down to Egypt because my purposes are going to be fulfilled there in Egypt." Third one is in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 4, where God speaks to Moses by the burning bush. And the Lord saw that he turned aside to look. God called him and said, "Moses, Moses, here I am. Now I'm calling you to deliver my people out of Egypt." He first spoke to Jacob to tell them to go to Egypt, and now he calls Moses to, after 400 years, to deliver them out of Egypt. The next one is in 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 10, where the little boy Samuel was sleeping, and the Lord came and stood and called, as at other times, saying, "Samuel, Samuel. Samuel, Samuel." That's the next instance, the fourth one. And the fifth one is in the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, Luke's Gospel, and chapter 10. Luke chapter 10 and verse 41. "But the Lord answered and said to her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things.'" That is the fifth instance where the Lord again has something very significant to say. One thing is needful, he says in the next verse, and that is to sit at his feet and hear his word. Luke 10:41. And the sixth instance is in Luke 22 and verse 31, where before Jesus goes to the cross, he speaks to Peter and says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Again, a very significant word that the Lord spoke. And the seventh one is in Acts chapter 9, verse 4, where the Lord is speaking to Saul of Tarsus, turning his whole life around, changing the direction of his life. He said, when Saul fell to the ground on the road to Damascus, the Lord spoke to him saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In each of these instances, if you take time to look at them, you find that there's something significant that the Lord was speaking when He called a person twice by the name. Usually He called a person once. But these are the 7 double calls of Scripture. And each of them is significant. And the first of these, as we've just seen, is in Luke 22:11, where God has something special to say. He says, Abraham, Abraham. He says, don't stretch out your hand against the Lord. I never wanted you to kill him. I only wanted to test you, to see whether you fear God. He says, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. We see there that this is the proof of the fear of God. We saw earlier the fear of God mentioned in Genesis 20 in relation to sexual sin. Here is the second reference in the Scripture to the fear of God, and the first time that God says concerning a human being, now I know that you fear God. What is the proof that we fear God? That when God speaks in secret, God spoke to Abraham in secret at night, he immediately obeys, again in secret. He took Isaac up to the top of the mountain and sacrificed him there without anybody seeing. An immediate obedience in secret to that which we have heard in secret. That is the proof that we fear God. There is no other proof. However much I may obey in those things where other believers can see me, it does not prove that I fear God. I may not fear God at all. The only test is when I have learned to obey God in those areas where other believers know nothing of what God has spoken to me in my conscience, in my heart, and where I have obeyed God in secret without a single other believer knowing anything about it. So when we examine our life to see whether we fear God or not, the test is this. In those areas where others cannot see me or know anything about my life, have I obeyed in secret before God? If there are no such areas in my life, I can sit in the best assembly in the world, but I do not fear Him. God cannot say, now I know that you fear God. God tests us. He tested Abraham nearly 50 years after He called him out first. And God will test us even 50 years after we are converted to see whether we fear Him. That's not a test that we say, oh, we passed that test long ago. He says, now I know. Now I know. Doesn't God know everything? Of course He knows everything. But yet He tests a man so that He can lead him on to something greater, so that we ourselves also know whether we fear God or not. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And we learn something more there, that the test of the fear of God is in obedience in something which is very costly, not something which is easy to do. There are many areas where obedience is easy. We've used the illustration of a father telling a child, eat that ice cream. Well, that's not difficult for that child to do. That obedience is very easy because the child loves to do it. But when the father says, come and help mommy to cut the vegetables when he would like to play at 5 o'clock in the evening, that's a little more difficult than obeying the command to eat that cup of ice cream. You know that. There is an obedience which is easy and delightful, and there's an obedience which is costly and difficult. When Abraham obeyed God, it was not like eating a cup of ice cream. It was so difficult. And it is in that obedience, which is expensive and costly and costs me everything, that I know whether I fear God or not. In most areas, we all obey so easily. There are so many areas we obey, but the test is not in those areas. Many things we do not prove that we fear God. It's good to do those things. We are obeying God, but they are not the test of whether we fear God or not. That is in the secret area, and where obedience has really cost us some tremendous sacrifice. And if there has not been such areas in our life, then that is probably an indication that we are still quite a few miles away from being tested in this simple area of the fear of God. We haven't taken it seriously. We haven't taken our spiritual education seriously. So, let's take a lesson from that. The proof of the fear of God.